This is the story of two engineers who came together by chance and who, in the short time they worked together, produced a legendary motorcycle that will live forever.
Philip Vincent first became actively involved with motorcycles with the design and his interpretation of a spring frame while he was at Cambridge University. And this frame, his idea, was patented in 1927, and that led up to the purchase of the HRD company some months later as a tool to market his invention.
His parents, I believe, initially didn't particularly want him to go into his chosen career, but because he'd stated at quite an early age this was what he wanted to do, and because he'd stuck with it right the way through, my grandfather said, well, if you can get a patent granted for designing something, I'll seriously consider you continuing with this career. So when he was quite a young man, he lodged his first patent for the triangulated spring frame, which was granted to him. So my grandfather said, yes, you've proved to me this is what you really want to do, so therefore I will help you achieve your aims.
Philip Vincent was certainly very ambitious to build an ultimate motorcycle. The specification of the bike was always very high, and spring frames around the spring frame around which was the basis of his bike was quite unusual in those days. There had been spring frame bikes before, but this was a very soundly designed thing.
I joined the Vincent HRD, as it then was, in April 1929. Mr. Vincent had come down from Cambridge. He just had a 21st birthday then. He was some 7 years older than me. I always remember this because I was 14, he was 21. We didn't have any power machinery whatsoever. If you wanted to drill a hole, you had a breast drill above all things. Imagine drilling a 3/8 plate with a breast drill, and that gives you some idea of the stone age that we were working in at the time. Mr. Walker and Mr. Vincent, they would go out of the front gate and walk half a mile up alongside the Great North Road, discussing business, I suppose, and ideas. In actual fact, Mr. Walker had been put into the company by Mr. Vincent's father, who was interested in the meat business and had a ranch, I think, in South America.
My father was an engineer. He wasn't a high-flying dynamic businessman. So Frank Walker took charge of things like making sure the accounts were done and just generally keeping an eye on things like cash flow. And he reported back to my grandfather quite regularly on how things were progressing.
When I went there, they were in the midst of of completing a bicycle and sidecar for a round the world trip. Gil was going to go round the world, and off he goes to Australia.
While he was in Australia, he met Phil Irving, and Irving came back with him, and once Irving had settled down over here, he got a job working for the Vincent HRD company, and he was very instrumental in engineering the bikes.
I was very fond of Irving because he was a man who could do anything. You know, if there was a problem, then he could come and solve it.
I suppose that the high point really before the war was the introduction of their own engine, which was a fairly significant happening for a company so small. And the bulk of the work on that engine was done by Phil Irving.
We were fitting proprietary engines at that time, JAP. They was the first engines, even in the very early days. Then we fitted the Rudge, Python so-called, and an odd Blackburn. Somewhere about there's a motorcycle with a Blackburn engine in. Never been able to trace it. Know who had it, but can't trace the engine.
My father would put a lot of effort into preparing to go off to a TT in his early years. It was a new company, he wanted to get it noticed. HRD had various successes at trials and TTs, so he wanted to carry that on because Had Raymond Davis had been his boyhood idol. But very often they were using Vincent design frames with Jap engines or other engines in, and Jap engines kept failing on him during the TT, so they'd have to go off with a crate full of Jap engines just to successfully ride in one TT. And he wanted to build an engine that would just go and go forever.
Then it was that Mr. Vincent thought we ought to be doing our own engine. So Vincent, Phil Irving got down to the drawing board in a little old ramshackle building where he had his drawing board, and he designed the first the 500, the single. It certainly looked as though we were going somewhere. Vincent decided to enter the TT, and an engine was particularly designed for it, with special heads. We had electron magnesium castings. These caused quite a bit of kerfuffle in the shop because they catch light when we've been machined on the milling machines. We had quite a team of riders. Jack Williams, Noel Christmas, a chap named Pope, and Ginger Wood. That was quite an exciting TT. If you were anybody in the motorcycle industry, you got to race, I think. They didn't win the TT, they did much better in the Ulster.
That was a 500cc single, and then that was used as a basis for the 1000cc twin, which appeared in 1936. And one could argue that that was probably the most significant bike or road machine of the 30s, or perhaps of the between the wars years. It was certainly the fastest machine on the road, standard road machine, and it had these other quite forward-thinking aspects the spring frame, dual brakes, and it was an effective machine. I mean, they in tuned form, they were known to exceed 130 miles an hour.
The Series A was obviously a development from the single. One looked at the single, and I think Mr. Vincent looked at the single and thought, we put another pot on here. We've got a twin, and so Irving got busy with his pencils, and the Series A was designed now.
It would seem that Phil Irving stumbled on the design of a V-twin, which produced the Rapide, by overlaying 2 cylinders of a 500cc Comet, and that spawned the idea of the Rapide.
Well, the Series A was very much a sensation, I should say, at that time. More talked about than bought, I would say, and was put in the same category as the Brough Superior at the time.
The concept of the machine was similar to the Brough SS100, namely a machine capable of exceeding 100 miles an hour, a sports machine capable of exceeding 100 miles an hour, but the Vincent, I feel, possibly was a lighter, lither machine.
The Series A, I think Mr. Vincent thought quite a lot of it. It was his idea, irrespective of whether Irving designed it or not. He threw the idea out, and it was very much his baby. It wasn't an easy seller, at least I don't think at that time. It was. And as how many we made, I think Johnny Air was assembling about 1 a week.
They made the twins and the singles, their own engine singles, the Comets and the Meteors, up until the war, and that range was known as the Series A range. In the years from 1934 up until the war, they made around about 800 singles of the various makes, and they made 80 Series A Rapides.
The Series A initially appealed to me when I first saw one because it was such an interesting machine to look at. Wherever you look at it, it's interesting. It's all the parts are exposed, you can see it working, it's pretty. And then to my sheer delight, it was a beautiful machine to ride when I eventually got it going. I bought it in 1970 and loved it ever since. Wonderful, wonderful machine. In practical terms, there are ideas that they have problems, mainly clutch, oil leaks. But as you can see, not many oil leaks. And the clutch, quite frankly, with modern friction materials, strong springs, no problems. The riding position is fairly low. I personally find it very comfortable, and other people I know that have ridden 1930s machines also say it's a very comfortable riding position. Handles very well, it's very light to handle. It's just delightful around corners. It feels very, very safe, has very good brakes. I always have this idea that Air Force officers would have this sort of machine, and probably few people could afford one. Very few were made. I think about 80 machines were made, and quite a few survive. Just enjoy it. I enjoy it. And it is a machine you can use quite happily today.
Of course, the war changed everything, as it did most people's lives. It certainly affected Vincent quite a bit. One of our directors, Bill Clark, a very nice fellow, an undergraduate from Oxford, had joined the company, become a director. His father had financed him, and he was called up in the Royal Air Force.
And unfortunately, Bill Clark was killed during the war. He was, I believe, a flight engineer or pilot in a Sterling. He crashed in, that was shot down over Holland in 1944.
Instead of motorcycles, we found we were making parts for bombs and depth charges and all sorts of things to do with the munition side of the factory. But there was all during that time we were still servicing motorcycles. Norman Brewster was in charge of the service department, and oft times I would have to repair frames, keep people going.
They also had another project which involved the design and development of an engine for possible use in airborne lifeboats. This was an opposed piston two-stroke that was originally, I think, possibly Vincent had intended to be the basis of the post-war motorcycle.
And we built for that engine a test house. It was a really delightful place. I did quite a bit of work in there, installing ventilation and air, cooling, and this provided test benches that we were able to put post-war engines on for test bed. Towards the last year of the war, there was a lot of correspondence in the motorcycle press, and that the works had received, about post-war bicycles that people were dreaming about, and nearly all of them were mentioned in the Twin, the Series A.
As far as the post-war production, motorcycle production was concerned, they obviously started considering this before the end of the war, because by the time the war ended, they were obviously had formulated their ideas on what they were going to do. Irving again was involved with the basic design of this, and obviously it was financed from the war effort. Well, the war effort obviously helped them significantly, and the first of the post-war machines, named the Series B range, the first one being the Series B Rapide, as a carry-on from the previous, the pre-war Series A Rapide, that appeared in 1946.
I remember Irving and Vincent working in the drawing office, and by that time they'd got a team of draftsmen doing the work in there, and off the board came the post-war twins. I remember the first one was Bob Canolti, who was an illustrative draftsman, did a drawing, and it was photographed and appeared on, I think it appeared on one of the catalogues. It looked really like a bicycle. It painted it was, as I say, it was an illustrated, and that was the first post-war Vincent was on paper.
It was a much more ambitious project than the pre-war bike had been, and as such it had greater identity really than the pre-war. Some people might disagree with that, but it was quite a different looking machine than the pre-war bike had been.
The personnel were very much a gang of enthusiasts working for very low wages. In fact, one of their adverts ran enthusiasts wanted to build the world's fastest motorcycle, and in small print at the bottom of the advert was, if interested in money, do not apply. And that was very true to life for the whole period that I was working at the factory. Money was Vincent made motorcycles, not money.
The people who bought Vincent's in those days were, for the most part, rather well-heeled, and as can be expected at the price, because you could buy a new Ford Popular if you could get one for £299, and a Rapide was over 300. So it was a select coterie of people who bought Vincent's. It wasn't the working man who was buying the Vincent.
He would often mention his first ride on the Series B, and his face would just light up and he would grin, and it was a naughty grin because I believe he was slightly exceeding the speed limit at the time.
I hadn't ever seen a Series A twin, but I went to a local hill climb in, it must have been 48, and saw a Rapide there. He wasn't competing, but it was a spectator who had a Series B Rapide, and of course everyone was around it, like flies around a honeypot.
The Vincent was a very advanced design for its day, and still, in many ways, it still has several advanced features, but it was advanced and it was designed to be repaired. Now, modern machines aren't designed to be repaired, they're designed to be used, worn out, thrown away. But the Vincent can really go on forever, because every moving part in it is designed to be removed and replaced with a new one. A lot of the early Vincent production was exported to Argentina because Phil Vincent had family connections with Argentina. And this is a set of Argentinian flywheels. They're Argentinian in the sense that they're original Vincent, but the big end and a few of the other components on them have been, shall we say, played around with in Argentina. But considering they had no spares to play with, they actually achieved quite a lot. Following on from that, we go to a 1947 basic Rapide. This is really what made Vincent's famous. This is their own design of engine. It includes their own gearbox. They're wonderful things. I've always liked them since I was 18, and I think I'll like them till the day I die. They're wonderful machines. The Vincent gearbox has very substantial straight cut gears. There's only really one major fault with the gearbox that sort of is generally known, in that during a period of shortage of steel supplies they used a substitute material which was not as, though on paper it was as good, in practice turned out to be not as good as the original EN36. Those gears can give problems. Nearly all the other faults that occur with the Vincent gearbox are invariably caused by bad assembly or 50-year-old components wearing out or coming loose, which I think is forgivable on anything that's 50 years old. The gearbox is assembled as a cluster in this manner into the gearbox. For clarity's sake, I've left off the cam plate and the selectors, but basically this is the operation. For those who are less familiar with the internals of this trusty steed, these two are the cam gears. This is a large driving idler driven directly from the crankshaft. This is a rather nice little affair on the standard Vincent, which is called a timed breather. This pinion has a slot in the back which corresponds to a hole in the external part of the crankcase to allow air to escape at timed intervals. The fibre pinion is directly on the end of the magneto, and the fibre pinion is there to cushion some of the shock created by the automatic advance and retard mechanism. Going back to the gearbox, to transmit power from the engine to the gearbox and to the back wheel, we come to the famous clutch. Only used on the twin, this clutch is unique in that it has a single primary outer plate, which is a single section of a multi-plate clutch, which, as that takes up the drive, it expands these two main shoes on these two pivot points, expands them into the clutch drum. The more effort required in turning the primary plate, the more force is applied into applying the clutch shoes. In theory, this should transmit a great deal of power. The only thing that stops it transmitting power is oil. Oil is the enemy of this clutch. Any oil on the main shoes will make it slip quite noticeably. Also, inside there are two spring units. One is used for resisting the turn of the primary plate so that the clutch doesn't snatch as soon as it's engaged, and the other one is used for centralising the shoes upon release so that they actually come off the drum. The balance of those two shoes is fairly critical and needs to be adjusted carefully. If it is adjusted well and everything is in good order and the clutch is assembled correctly, the clutch works very well indeed. The Vincent engine unit is a massive affair, particularly on the twin, and because of the strength, the inherent strength of this unit, you can do away with the normal loops of frame going down. So thus the engine is bolted directly to the upper frame member, down through the rear cylinder to the rear suspension. I've been struck almost with awe at the sheer size of the engine. Of course, as it replaces the frame, it appears much bigger than maybe in some ways it really is. But this attraction has stayed with me for 30 years. I still think they're wonderful.
Because of the state of British industry at this time, there was the export or die philosophy from the British government. Vincent's envisaged exporting a good proportion or the bulk of their production, which they had to do to become eligible for supply of raw materials to produce the bike. And to this end, the bulk of the production of the bikes did go abroad, and they went to some very far-flung places. if my memory serves me right, I think of the first 150 machines, production of which started roughly in the autumn of 1946. Only about 15 or 20 bikes actually were sold in this country.
Shadow, yes, I think was very well received. It had a certain aura about it, the all-black engine, which was a very unusual feature in its day. And of course the 150 mile an hour clock really set it off. And the fact that it also had a greater performance than the Rapide, which was good by any standard, did make it an instant hit in my view. People really wanted the Black Shadow. The name was very evocative as well.
The main thing about riding Vincents, if one is used to riding modern machines, is the saddle heights are so much lower, the weights are so much lower, and the centre of gravities tend to be lower, mainly because of high suspension travels of modern machines. So in a lot of respects they do feel more handleable and more, should we say, chuckable than modern machines. The Black Shadow, when it was announced in February 1948, the two first machines were road tested by various people. Motorcycling road tested one particular Black Shadow and it achieved 122 miles an hour, and it was said that a French magazine road tested the second one and that achieved 128 miles an hour, and it had an acceleration rate of around about 6 seconds up to 60 miles an hour, which, when you consider that was the sort of performance that was achieved by the E-Type Jaguar, which didn't appear for another 11 years.
Who's going to hammer off? You're going to hammer off?
Sorry?
Are you going to hammer off?
Well, I suppose we've been instructed to, haven't we?
Well, I think one of us.
I don't mind. Or both. In fact, hang the expense, we'll both hang the petrol, we'll both go.
If it goes.
Oh, ye of little faith, eh?
The introduction of the Black Shadow was very much Philip Vincent's ideas, and I can clearly remember putting up a black mark against me when he asked my opinion of the appearance of it, and I said I preferred the appearance of the Rapide engine. He was clearly dead right, because the success of the black engine is now well known. And has even been carried on throughout the 90s with modern engines black. It also had a strong attraction from the factory point of view, because the profit margin on the Black Shadow was twice as high as the profit margin on the Rapide. So we were at one stage being called on to make, and not necessarily sell, of course, because of the increased cost, but it was in the interest of the continuation of the factory that we should make only Black Shadows. The profit margin of the 3 bikes was very, very significant. The profit margin on the Comet was £7, £31 on the Rapide, and £65 on the Black Shadow. Phil Vincent, in his glimpse into the future, was quite right with the black engine, whereas many of the diehards of the day were anti-black paint, which was not considered a good heat conductor. Not gloss black paint. Matte black was good as a heat conductor, but wasn't attractive from a sales point of view.
A certain number of machines were tuned and did achieve quite significant speeds. In fact, they broke several world speed records in the hands of mainly Americans, and this led to the Black Lightning. Basically a machine intended for competition. It was tuned to a fairly high degree. They made approximately 30 of these.
We were making a motorcycle which few people could afford to buy, and the fact that Vincent himself was definitely not money orientated and tended to brush aside the financial aspects of manufacture and concentrate on the sporting and world record attempts and such activities as led to the success and the legendary state of the Vincent to this day. The two of them had equal effect on the outcome in terms of the bike's design, but a lot of the detail was left to Irvine, who was very much more the practical one of the two. Vincent's idea of running the company was never to make money, but just to make motorcycles, which he managed to achieve. he was obviously very enthusiastic about everything, probably to an overbearing result, but it needed to be that way because there was always a problem of finance and difficulty in acquiring the equipment to manufacture a motorcycle. Bearing in mind it was immediately post-war. Needed an enthusiastic managing director to cope with it all, and always the forbidding scene of lack of finance, which stayed with the company throughout the period I worked for them.
Vincent was optimistic. He was still thinking of ideas in front. He was, as I say, he was an ideas man. There wasn't any doubt about that. Reading Irving, he never seemed to think that he was being, shall I say, being valued enough and being paid enough for what he was doing. He felt he was not being valued enough. I think he finished on his own at that time. That was the end of his period with us.
The Monterey attempt was primarily a publicity exercise. The intention was to take the long-distance records with the Black Shadows and the shorter, higher-speed records with the Black Lightnings. The arrival at the track at Monterey was met with the hottest spell of weather ever experienced. This in itself was to prove problems in achieving the 8 world records that we took with Black Shadows. The Black Lightnings were well capable of taking the records, but were prevented from doing so by due to tyre failures. The load on the bankings at the 150 mile per hour lap speeds of the Lightnings was such that the tyres failed within 50 minutes. We had begun failures, and it was generally thought that Vincent's decision to run the Black Shadows with the crowded roller were responsible for this. This was completely untrue, however, and the real cause of the problem was that the oil broke down completely due to the high temperatures, which I previously mentioned, and the evidence of this wasn't immediately apparent because the big ends failed. The bikes were not stripped until returned to the factory. When we returned to the factory, we found that with 10 hours running, they'd totally worn out the cams and cam followers and everything else that moved in the engine. We had evidence of oil breakdown, and we were stopping the bikes and changing the oil at 1 hour on Castrol's recommendation. But the persistence on running as you can buy oil was contributed to the failure. Had we used Castrol R, they would have survived much better.
This is a pipe bending machine that Vincent bought in 1946 at the start of the Series B production. Prior to the war, they had bought all the exhaust pipes in, but with the prospect of increased production, they set themselves up to make their own pipes. At some stage early on, it was motorised. It's quite a remarkable machine, really, because it's still going to this day. Every Vincent exhaust pipe had been bent on this since 1946, and that covered the Series Bs, the Series Cs and the Series Ds. So when you consider that the thing is 51 years old and possibly bent perhaps up to 30,000 sets of pipes over that period, it's quite remarkable, really. This device was designed in the Vincent tool room, and basically it's to measure inaccuracies in wheel rims during wheel building. Any movement is transmitted into the sensing head along this rod, through the link and into the indicator rod. Any movement that exists is magnified approximately 4 times, and the indication is made here. The other clever aspect of it was that it nullified, the measuring head nullifies any variations in wheel rim width, and also any slight buckling, which you cannot adjust by spoke tension. This is a fair example, really, of Vincent's attention to detail and his desire to produce a bicycle of a good high standard. At the start of the Series C range in 1949, Vincent had very little in the way of opposition, but during the next 4 or 5 years, other motorcycle manufacturers were introducing machines which were a potential opposition to the Vincent, and at the end of 1954 Vincent's introduced an uprated range with the most significant improvements being to the suspension, and also the introduction of full enclosure for those who wanted full weather protection. And this was achieved by a stylised enclosure around the front wheel, the centre section of the bike and the rear section. And this enclosure was manufactured from fiberglass, which was in the very early days of fiberglass production. The reaction to the Series D at its introduction was fairly mixed. Some people liked it and the practicality of it. Other people just didn't like the appearance. These would have been the traditional motorcycling types. Didn't like the appearance of the Series D, presumably because it didn't look at all sporting.
I find it's quite ironic that he was absolutely slaughtered in the press for producing this enclosed model bike, and when you look at what's on the road today, there are many that look very similar to the design he came up with.
I think it's fair to say that Vincent had always had a slight leaning towards enclosing machines, because he had an attempt at doing this in the early 30s. And I think probably the reception was much the same then as it was in 1955 to the Black Knight and the Black Prince.
For most people, the golden era of Vincent's was from the late 40s through into the early 50s. But I think then a number of factors contributed to Vincent's ceasing trading. In my mind's eye, I think one major factor was the fact that companies such as Ford were producing family cars which cost less and less money. So the traditional motorcycle buyer was able to afford to buy a family car, and then there came a point where a small Ford cost less than a Vincent motorcycle.
At one time they produced the Firefly, which was a attachment to go on a bicycle, and But then subsequently they took on the agency for the Quickly, for the German Quickly, which really did rock it. And at one time Vincents were bringing them in by the trainload and selling them as quickly as they could unload them. But then the manufacturers of Quickly decided to have their own agency in this country, and Vincent's lost the Quickly, the agency for Quicklies. The Firefly by that time had virtually run its course, and I suppose these cumulative things meant that the financial side of Vincent's was again in some danger, and subsequently they had no choice but to go into bankruptcy.
Production of motorcycles at Vincent's ceased at the end of 1955, and then they carried on then making their range of small two-stroke industrial engines basically of 75cc and 100cc's, and these were used in all manner of applications, and also in the powering of another radical Vincent idea, namely the Amanda water scooter.
I feel the final nail in the coffin was the failure of the Amanda water scooters. That had been a very large and lucrative order, and my father had put in such a lot of work, A, in developing and designing the Amanda, and B, in getting the order. I remember in particular once we travelled to London because my father was going to have a meeting with the American that had ordered them. His name was Wacky Arnold, I believe. And my father went off to the Dorchester to meet this chap for lunch while my mother and I went off shopping. But it was a sort of big thing when he got back, I've got the order. And he felt that that would save the company, and when the hulls failed, it was just such a disappointment to him. The hull of the water scooter had been specified to be a certain thickness, but the company manufacturing them were under financial pressures, and they thought that they might get away with making the hull a bit thinner, so the result was when you ran the water scooter, the hull started to melt. I remember my father being so upset and angry about it, but by then it was too late, and the Americans cancelled the order.
The attraction of the Vincent was that it was a very lazy motor, pretty slow revving. The handling was always very positive. The braking was normally better than any of its of the machines that were available at that time. And apart from the headlights, which were bloody awful, it was generally a thoroughly nice machine all around.
It was unique in a lot of ways, and it did its job very well, and to this day it's still a very usable machine.
Give a Vincent an open road, give it the right style of countryside, the right style of touring, they still take an awful lot of beating because they're just nice to be on. They feel so good.
With the French say, formidable. Yes, it was the sheer excellence of the machine that captivated those who owned it.
Here lies a great idea. fashioned by great imagination and many skills of many people.
Hello, my name is Philip Vincent Day. My grandfather made Vincent motorbikes. When I grow up, I'm going to make some more Vincent motorbikes for my grandfather.